So, what is the fearful avoidance idea of the perfect relationship? Today, we're going to dive into that. But first, if you're new to my channel, my name is Marcella. I'm an attachment practitioner trained by Tice Gibson in the Personal Development School. I have a bachelor's degree in business, and I'm the owner of the Fearless Love Academy, where I help women change their mindset to change their love story after trauma. So, let's just dive in. First and foremost, if you're not familiar with the fearful avoidant attachment style, this attachment style stems from a lot of chaos, trauma, or abuse. Now, this can be directly to the fearful avoidant in earlier childhood, or it can be indirectly, where they're exposed in their environment to things such as parents fighting or their parents having some kind of substance abuse that causes caregivers to be very unpredictable in their behavior. Now, when we are getting in terms of what the fearful avoidance idea of a perfect relationship is, there are a couple key factors to this. Number one is going to be passion and depth. If you are a fearful avoidant, you probably already know that you really value being in a relationship dynamic where you feel deeply desired, deeply known, and deeply wanted, right? And this is because passion, in a sense, can kind of be a little chaotic in nature, right? And this tends to be the subconscious comfort zone for a fearful avoidant attachment style. Our subconscious comfort zone is basically what we grew up around, and that's what is familiar to us. So, what happens is our brain adopts this as our subconscious comfort zone, and as a result, we are attracted to these things in our adult life. Why? Because it's familiar, and our brain equates familiarity with safety. So, fearful avoidants tend to value having a lot of passion, where things are kind of on this constant all-time high, or they're feeling very deeply wanted in their relationship, or you're having all these heightened experiences, right? They also really like to have depth of connection in their relationship. Why? Because this usually, for the fearful avoidant, tends to be connected to a sense of safety. So it's like depth of connection means to really know somebody deeply, inside and out. Know their deepest fears, their desires, their patterns, their characteristics, their traits, all of these things. And for the fearful avoidant, they have a sense of hypervigilance around them, where they are hyper attuned and hyper focused to everything around them. Where this stems from is usually growing up in environments, again, where they felt unsafe. If they can attune to people and they can really get to know them and be able to predict what is going on, then they can prevent anything bad from happening and stay safe. The same thing in their romantic relationships. If they can get very attuned to the person, they can get to know them inside and out. This is how the fearful avoidant can feel very safe in their romantic connections, because then they can kind of predict, of course, what is going to happen and remain safe. Another big thing for the fearful avoidant is going to be transparency, right? Fearful avoidance, if you aren't familiar, have a humongous betrayal core wound. This feeling of I am or will be betrayed eventually. Fearful avoidance get this core wound from earlier in childhood, from a lot of inconsistency and a lack of consideration and a lack of congruencies. Because there's so much inconsistency in the fearful avoidance early childhood, they get this feeling of like not being able to trust their caregivers to show up for them for the things that they need, or just to even just love them correctly. So a lot of people assume needing transparency in relationship comes from possibly being cheated on in the past, and that's not actually where it comes from. For fearful avoidance, this actually shows up in the form of like the fact that their caregivers weren't really showing up to meet their needs or to love them correctly, or when the fearful avoidant needed to rely on them, they couldn't actually rely on them for what they actually needed. So this is where the I am betrayed core wound comes in for the fearful avoidant. So they tend to value transparency, like I mentioned. They really need people to let them know what is going on, like on a day-to-day basis. They would really love just a lot of communication around plans, around what to expect in the evening, just being very transparent and open. This can help the fearful avoidant feel very safe in the connection and kind of feel very comfortable, and maybe even be able to start opening up, because because fearful avoidants with this core wound kind of have a wall up some of the time, and they have this feeling like the ball is going to drop eventually, and they're always on the lookout for any signs that can set off that alarm bell to be like, oh my gosh, we're unsafe, like let's abandon ship. So transparency is huge for fearful avoidant. A lot of people can get this tripped up with the feeling of being controlled in a relationship, and there's such a huge difference between being controlled in a relationship, because this is like where you have to ask for permission, right, for things, versus just being transparent and open with your partner because they have a wounded part of them and they just need a little extra like love in that area so that they can feel safe, right? And over time what happens is, like, with a lot of transparency in a relationship, fearful avoidants end up being able to feel comfortable with that person, and eventually they're not needing it as much anymore, and you'll see this kind of fall off over time once that connection is built. Another big one for the fearful avoidant, kind of going hand in hand with transparency, is going to be trust in the relationship with fearful avoidance. So fearful avoidance tend to need trust in their romantic relationships. Why? Because they have the betrayal core wound. Trust is a huge need for the fearful avoidant. If they don't have trust in their relationship, the relationship is very hard to sustain long term. Why? Because fearful avoidants need this in order to feel safe. It is their biggest, most painful core wound, and when this is tripped up, they can feel very volatile in this connection. They can feel like a lot of things are going downhill, like it's doomed, and then they can react to these things based on that. What trust really means, it's birthed from these 3 C's, and that's going to be consideration, consistency, congruency. So fearful avoidants really need to feel considered. It's like, whatever decisions you are making, fearful avoidants need to know that you are taking them into consideration in the process. You are taking them and their needs and their feelings into consideration before making any decisions, right? Congruency. What you say, what you do really align. And so if you say, hey, I'm gonna go to the store and buy us some groceries tonight at 5 p.m. and something comes up and for some reason you couldn't do it and you just come home and you don't say a word, that is what you say and what you do does not align. That doesn't sit well with the fearful avoidant. They need to know that they can trust you. And so what you say, what you do needs to align. And if it doesn't, fearful avoidants tend to be very well at like understanding things, right? As long as there's, like I mentioned, transparency, like you're being very open with them and kind of giving them a little bit of context around why you didn't or why you couldn't. Fearful avoidants are very good at understanding, but don't just sweep it under the rug and just not communicate with them at all, right? Fearful avoidants need to have that communication to feel safe. And then consistency. That is the last C in trust, consideration, congruency, consistency. Consistency means that, if we talk every single day at lunchtime, fearful avoidants really love that consistency because they are hyper vigilant. They can tend to feel unsafe in the relationship when there's no consistency because they didn't have consistency in earlier childhood. So they very much value that in their adult life. So when there's not consistency, fearful avoidants can link that back to being unsafe because there was so much unpredictability, remember, in their childhood. So it's like, as soon as things are unpredictable or they're not consistent, fearful avoidants can assume, just like back in childhood, sometimes their caregivers were really nice, sometimes their caregivers were really mean, or sometimes a pattern change or inconsistency could mean something bad was going to happen. Sometimes it could be something very bad, sometimes it could be something very good. And so fearful avoidants tend to get a little bit scared. They get fearful when things aren't consistent because they think, oh my gosh, is something bad going to happen, right? This is kind of their early associations. So consideration, consistency, congruency are very huge for the fearful avoidant to have in their romantic relationships. Now, when any of these things are not met, when these needs are not met for the fearful avoidant, it can cause a lot of volatility in a fearful avoidant attachment. Why? Because Fearful avoidance, they swing also between being hot and cold in relationships. And because they grew up in chaos, they have this association that love equals chaos, and they probably witnessed a lot of fighting in the home. So for them, this is very normal. And we know it's not a healthy behavior, right? But fearful avoidance, because they have these early childhood associations, whenever something isn't lining up or needs aren't met, or they're feeling like betrayed, or they're feeling like not considered, any of these things, fearful avoidance can go into defense mode, into attack mode, where they can be a little harsh with words. They can become a little spiteful, where if you hurt me, I want to hurt you back. They can become very critical. They can yell, they can slam things around and kind of just be passive aggressive, right? These kind of things can show up for a fearful avoidant, and they aren't healthy behaviors at all. So I'm not saying that it is okay to have these kind of behaviors. No, I'm not saying that at all. In fact, if you're noticing these things, I think it's time that you start working on healing, right? And if you're here watching this video, I know that that's what you're interested in, but it's very important to get a grasp on these things, because over time, pretty much, you can sabotage relationships and connections with people that you love by falling into these patterns and not being able to work on them, and also being able to communicate these things that you want, because fearful avoidants tend to expect these things without even communicating them. So it's like a lot of the volatility that's showing up in your life now, if it's really what's showing up, is usually because there's a lack of knowledge around knowing what these needs are. So now that you have an idea of kind of what some of these are, you can go take them out into the world and communicate them to your partner. Usually people will show up well if you communicate these things directly and positively and in a healthy way. But if you don't communicate them at all, how are people going to know? People are not mind readers, right? So it's very important to understand what your needs are as a fearful avoidant, to take them out into the world and to communicate them, and also to start working on your healing journey. These core wounds that fearful avoidants have, they're solvable problems. We can do subconscious reprogramming work to kind of reprogram these core wounds out for good. If that is something that you are interested in, you can always click on my website in the description box below. I will have the link to my website where you can check out any coaching opportunities that I might have open. I also have a fearful avoidant blueprint that's available for just $10. And in this blueprint, I kind of show you the ins and outs, the characteristics of fearful avoidance, what their needs are. You don't have to go look for all the answers. You can just see it in that fearful avoidant blueprint. Subscribe to this channel if you're interested in more videos focused on the fearful avoidant attachment style. I hope you have a wonderful day. God bless.